your host, Tian Wei.
From Beijing, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live from CGTN. We start with a closer look at the new European Union rules to rein in tech giants. The proposed rules include two complementary pieces of law, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act is set to focus on stepping up oversight of illegal and harmful content, while the Digital Markets Act is set to stop companies' predatory practices that lead to uncompetitive market dominance. U.S. digital giants could be forced to change their practices, find up to 10% of their annual turnover, or even break up their European businesses if they are found violating the new rules. The move comes as the bloc aims to have one set of rules to govern the digital EU market and to put an end to the monopolistic behaviors. So what could be the big changes following these new regulations? Let's loop in our panelists to find out. And for more on this, in Brussels, we have Bruno Leibharberg, who is the Director General of the Center for Regulation in Europe. Also in Brussels, Alec Burnside, a partner with the law firm Dietert. I hope I pronounced that name right. And in New York, via Skype, Max Wolf, Managing Partner of Multivariate in Beijing. Last but not least, Chu Qiang, Assistant Director from the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So let me go to you directly, Mr. Leibharberg. Tell me more about what is the real goal of these two acts. Are they about blocking the American tech companies from the European markets or something else?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on the program. No, I think the objective is definitely not to punish neither big tech nor U.S. companies. The objective is to prevent the big companies from impeding smaller players to scale out, and therefore to hurt and put a brake to the capability of innovation that those companies have. In the same way, this is not against the U.S. This is against companies which have a number of characteristics, and over the years, over a period of 10 years, they have developed. They were not regulated so far, and we see that along to the benefits that those organizations bring to consumers, to citizens, there are also a number of harms, a number of risks, and these are to be controlled and to be dealt with by, as you said, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act.
Would that feeling the same or similar inside the United States, Mr. Wolf, or do you think this is targeted, as some American businesses have argued, or rather different?
Yeah, so I do think it's a bit different. So obviously it's always a greater sensitivity when it's a foreign company, but we see this very similar legislation attempting to work its way through both the state legislatures here in the 50 U.S. states as well as at the federal level. So it's clearly something that American citizens and American legislators are quite worried about too, vis-a-vis American companies. And I think something running in the background that people don't always think about, but part of the reason for the international sensitivities is a modern social media company, a modern tech company, is actually a global intelligence agency. And so there are some national sensitivities there. But separate and apart from that, these are large institutions that actively monetize and collect all, and including quite sensitive data, on billions of people. And so they probably do need a regulatory structure that isn't left over from 1980s and 1990s television and radio regulation, which is a lot of what's in place now.
Mr. Burnside, of course, this is all happening at an interesting time. It is right before the new administration in the U.S. comes into power, which is, betting on, quote unquote, building further the allied relationship with some of the European capitals, including with Brussels. So, Mr. Burnside, what do you make of this interesting twist?
I don't think, frankly, that the American election and the new presidency is relevant. This legislation has been in the pipeline for a while. It's certainly not triggered by any change in political sentiment. The rising consensus over the last many years amongst antitrust agencies of the world is that the antitrust rules need to be supplemented by specific regulation, and that's the specific regulation that we find coming forward. Certainly it's true that antitrust enforcement in Europe has led the way, and the other agencies are catching up. And there has been some sensitivity from the American side that it's often been American-based companies who've been under antitrust enforcement. Now the Americans are coming in the same direction. In particular, if you look at the report of the Judiciary Subcommittee, and indeed the actions brought against Google and Facebook. So I see this as part of a longer-term pattern and not specifically related to the change of presidency in the States.
Mr. Chu, you're observing all of this from afar here in China. We have seen, though, global tech giants are facing tougher situations in terms of legislative and rules worldwide. How do you see this very unique period of time for global tech companies? And certainly, we have seen Chinese, American, and European tech companies that are facing interesting situations.
Well, I think this is not a unique period of time. This is a due time. Well, recently, if you noticed, probably you have seen a very strong similarity happening towards those tech giants, not only in America, but also in Europe, as we just mentioned, which is the topic of today, but also in China. Well, for one time, I think all the countries, the West or East or Middle East or the Southeast Asia, everybody, for the first time, been on the same page about the tech giants. Well, they're getting the monopoly position, and everybody are saying monopoly are bad. And we're saying, due to the pandemic, the world economy is going down. We're seeing people are just suffering from the pandemic situation economically. And but the tech giants are still getting the profit. They have a greasy palm over everywhere. And if you take a look at the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones index, and you will find out, well, the whole index is going up. But if you look carefully into it, you will find out the only one growing up is the tech giants' stock price. The other traditional sectors are still falling. So why is that? Because in the pandemic, only the tech giants has the capability to squeeze out the other traditional players with their cyber capabilities. So the cake is getting smaller and smaller, but they got the proper knife to cut the bigger cake for themselves. So for the first time, everybody understands this on the same page.
But on the other hand, what's wrong with that? I mean, what's wrong with the tech giants having bigger share of the market as a time of pandemic? Because people all realize this is important online. So, Mr. Wolf, how do you see this interesting debate that has always been going on about the market vis-a-vis legislations?
Yeah, so I do think that the pandemic has done two things. One is enduring, one is probably fleeting. So one is it's pushed forward what would have taken 10 or 12 years maybe of life migrating online into less than 10 or 12 months. So that's an acceleration of what was in place. And there's also an artificial surge as everyone tries to do everything remotely, and remotely generally means online, whether that's grocery deliveries or holiday shopping or appointments of all types or even education, etc. So there's been a forced play. It's also true that when governments are deep in deficit and when populations are suffering unemployment and economic decline, printing money as aggressively as these companies did has probably enhanced scrutiny that pre-existed around the way they deal with privacy and the way they deal with competition. And as much as we celebrate our IPOs here, and we've had a rash of exciting ones, we don't see, which is a lot of the startups are being purchased by a small number of larger and larger tech companies. And that gets to concerns which I think are pretty global now, that the biggest players have so much earnings that they're kind of driving the evolution of consumer tastes as opposed to responding to them. That's a classic definition of a market monopoly.
But Mr. Leibhaber, at this time, many are concerned about the future potential of our economy. Of course, at a time influenced by the pandemic, we don't know how long this will last. So is it the dampening effect on these high-tech companies or global ones, are they going to have an even harsher impact on our economy overall? How do you look at the timing?
I think, you know, as was said previously, the timing is the one which is, you know, these things are taking place, as I said earlier, after those companies which emerged 20 years ago in a non-regulated environment, developed, burgeoned, provided a number of services, provided a number of possibilities to consumers, to citizens. They just realize, the policymakers come to realize that those organizations have not been regulated so far. And they are not, contrary to what is the situation with more mature industries. Take, for instance, the telecom industry, which is highly regulated. So there is an unlevel playing field, which, if you want, needs to be restored. And it needs to be restored in a way that citizens can and users can fully enjoy the benefits, but be protected against a number of harms which are not only related to the consumption of those services, but also to the democratic process in our societies. And this is, for instance, what the Digital Services Act is about. It's about forcing, making stringent requirements on the platforms to take down, to detect and take down illegal content, and make sure also that counterfeit, illicit goods do not, which do not comply with European safety rules, for instance, are being consumed in our markets.
But on the other hand, how should we see the streamline of standards? I mean, we of course have legislations also going on inside the United States now, also among the EU countries, and China has also been working on the anti-monopoly and antitrust of the high-tech companies in recent weeks. But how to streamline the standards so that global companies can, with similar standard operating around the world? That is always an interesting question. Today, of course, particularly about the digital economy. Mr. Burnside.
You're right that streamlining would be nice. It's probably overambitious. What can certainly be said is that there is a consensus as to the direction of travel. There have been reports, studies obtained in many countries, in Europe, in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Australia, Japan, Korea, all saying that more needs to be done in this direction. The fact that rules are not identical is a fact of business life for companies in every part of the world. We have different data protection rules. For example, in my own particular field, antitrust, we have different rules governing the notification of mergers. But the substantive interest in governing mergers and in preventing cartels and abuses of dominance, those are matters of consensus and common travel. And if we have to go through a period of experience and adaptation and alignment, then so be it. The alternative of doing nothing is a poor alternative.
at a time when the world needs to really work on together the cooperation about the rules and also governance, global governance about the digital economy. We are seeing much more complex situation, geopolitics, politics, and of course exacerbated by the pandemic. So how much, Mr. Wolf, do you see we can have a more concerted effort in terms of what kinds of regulations and rules we could have so that these global companies could really face a more or similar stages when they're going around the world, Mr. Wolf?
Yeah, so I'm actually somewhat optimistic. I think the general public has been forced to live its life heavily online, as have legislators, as have all of us, and I think that kind of has put a pretty bright spotlight on the issues we have in terms of online governance. I would agree that we're probably not going to have harmonized rulemaking for the foreseeable future, but if we can get a core corpus of kind of road rules, then people can drive with minimal accommodation across the national boundaries, because the internet will always be a challenge for international coordination because it has a quasi-stateless element to some extent, in at least in some regions, where it's very hard to contain inside national boundaries what's going on without taking highly restrictive measures, which can create other issues. So I think we're going to have to see a little bit of a coming together, and I think we're also going to have to see a pretty close working relationship between the United States and China, because there are kind of two parallel internet architectures that are forming across that divide. Not completely, but to some extent, and so harmonizing those two would be very important to sort of harmonize the global leadership in AI and some of the new technology developments.
Well, we're also seeing the potential there could be escalation of so-called tech wars, which happened over the past 2 to 3 years between China and the United States. So very important, Mr. Leihaberg, how much common ground do you think the world should really keep and seek together in this regard? What are some of at least the basic elements that everyone has to work together in order to set up these rules and make sure it could work?
I agree with that, and I would say that obviously we would all benefit from having an integrated regulatory environment for those global players. We have to take into account, though, that while the direction of travel is similar in various parts of the world, the drivers for action are not necessarily the same. To simplify, I would say that while in the US the primary driver is the integrity of the market and of a workable working market, in Europe, in China, it's perhaps the fact that those big companies control so many data about citizens that they become a challenge to the control and the power of the state. And in Europe, clearly what is driving us is the fact that we want to have ethical rules, that we are very much concerned about human rights, about the fact that our fundamental rights may be threatened by the activities or sometimes the absence of activities of those players. But this being said, I would say that personally I'm in favor of, I would call this a kind of global deal between regulators and the platforms, because don't forget, we talk about the benefits and the harms and the risks created by those platforms, like Janus, you know, two faces. So I think that rather to oppose the law, I would strongly encourage the big tech to build up a cooperative approach with regulators and policymakers all over the world to the joint benefits. I do not think that at this stage, and given in particular that we have, as we said, you know, basically the same political will to control or limit the action of those platforms, I don't think that an adversarial position on behalf of the platforms would be something which would be beneficial not only for the world, but for them in particular.
I see. Mr. Chu, your take.
Well, according to my opinion, well, we're facing a very interesting situation. Probably the situation, you know, the funder of those tech companies didn't even think about it, and can imagine when they try to start the whole businesses. And Mark Zuckerberg, well, would he know he will possess such a great power when you just try to start some tricky game in the school, in the university? Does Jack Ma or Pony Ma know that he will going to be that kind of a powerful figure in the businesses? Probably they just want to start a little game company or just a shopping companies online, and that's all. Nobody ever imagined this kind of issue was going to happen, no matter in China or in America. I think the challenge is common. Both China and both America, both Europe, we're going to face the same thing. We're going to on the same page. And both the business cycle or the government or the whole society need a new take on this. For example, the government for the first time tried to understand what's an impact with the tech giants holding so much big data and analyze it with AI and come up with some unique analytics and how much influence it's going to have towards the whole society. And also the big companies, they need to behave with a moral standard. But of course, we cannot just trust those capitals and their own consensus. So we need legal regulations and all. And the whole society, we need anti-mechanism. So we cannot just throw away our privacies, and also we need our own judgment towards all the advertisement or the analytics. So I think we all have responsibilities. If we work together, I think we will come up with the solution.
It's very interesting to talk about different stakeholders and different solutions. Therefore, I want to go back to you, Mr. Wolf, about that. You know, what is the best way? Is setting up regulations the best way, or provide literacy to the public about online content the best way, or make sure there's going to be fairer competition in various fields, and not just about the online companies? So these are questions, I guess, we have to weigh while we are working on these kinds of regulations, Mr. Wolf.
Absolutely, but we need them all. So none in isolation will fully function. And look, one of the rules of the modern internet appears to be, given the high cost of having a global infrastructure and server banks and dealing with data, that there's a nearly universal return to scale. So if you have an industry with a huge return to scale, we have a lot of years of regulatory experience that such industries require more regulatory curation than industries that don't have quite as much of return to scale, right? Because otherwise, and we've seen some of that. It's not a crushing problem yet, but we've seen that large tech companies largely look at each new innovation, either copy it and bankrupt the companies who are seeking to do the innovation, or buy them. And that is actually a bit anti-competitive. So one does have to be careful there.
However, Mr. Burnside, many of these tech companies are important in their national politics. You could see them playing a big role, for example, in the U.S. When the election was going on, standing on this side or that side of the candidates. So many wonder whether we're going to see, you know, a lot of talk about regulations, but eventually have an only watered down version of all the kinds of regulations that policymakers are talking about, Mr. Burnside.
You know, back at the very origin of American antitrust law was the concern that big business would have political power, and that has shown itself time and again to be true. The world looks on with interest to see exactly who takes positions of influence in the new Biden administration. The tech companies have influence, but they are there are still democratic processes, and there's debate. Their voice, from my point of view, should be less strong. I hope it will be less strong in the States than it may have been in previous administrations. In Europe, of course, they have contacts and influence, and quite rightly, in government, but they're also subject to controls. And the two pieces of legislation that we're talking about today here in Europe, which have just been proposed, are part of finding that right balance and picking up a theme from your question a moment ago. Which tools do we need? We need a combination of tools. Literacy amongst the public is very much one of them, but also proper care and attention in the way that the big tech companies operate, and supervision by well-calibrated public tools, also very necessary.
Alec Burnside, Bruno Leibharberg, Max Wolf, and Chu Chiang, thank you so much, gentlemen, helping us to understand much more about the two legislations and certainly the global campaign against monopoly in the high-tech area. Thank you. Really appreciate it.